This week we talked about the geopolitics of the clean energy transition and discussed a first piece by Bordoff and O'Sullivan on green upheaval and potential destabilizing effects of the transition. We also talked about the risks of decoupling the US and Chinese economies. We delved deeper into the supply chain dependencies of the US on China for clean energy technologies, and then talked about broader potential national security risks of that dependence, and then discussed the sustainability security nexus. The first piece we read by Bordoff and O'Sullivan, The Green Upheaval, examined whether the clean energy transition would have destabilizing effects on geopolitics. And they take issue with the hopeful notion that the clean energy transition will necessarily yield a more peaceful world, while that end state of a world less reliant on fossil fuels might indeed be peaceful, given the potential for resource curse issues associated with fossil fuels. The transition itself is likely to be destabilizing for a number of reasons. They talk about how there's increased competition and contestation over minerals and technologies associated with the clean energy transition. So China's dominance of those supply chains enhances their geopolitical advantage and may be a source of friction with other countries. The geological siting of minerals deposits in key countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo and its deposits of cobalt may enhance the centrality of new places on the planet and make either their power or those sites sources of contestation and friction, as well as the US and China seek access to those minerals. You also have a very long ramp time for the transition away from fossil fuels, in which fossil fuels will still considerably be used for some time, and that may enhance the geopolitical position of low-cost producers of natural gas and oil in the interim, even if in the long run there'll be a move away from those energy sources. So for all of these reasons, they think the clean energy transition will not necessarily be peaceful. That transition period may have some destabilizing effects. Bordoff and O'Sullivan mentioned that China's dominance of clean energy supply chains has become a source of friction already. And in reaction to that, the US and the Biden administration sought to de-risk, if not fully decouple, supply chains from China in the wake of the COVID outbreak. And one of the pieces we read by Michael Davidson and his co-authors assessed the risks of decoupling. Full decoupling would mean that the US would eliminate any supply chain ties with China by sourcing all materials from other countries. And the core risk that Davidson and his co-authors see is that this would raise the costs and make the clean energy transition less likely, delay longer, and make the effects of climate change that much worse. If China is the lowest cost producer of many of these technologies, then efforts to decouple the US from China would essentially raise those costs considerably. Now, they go further in this piece to assess the specific economic and national security risks of a number of clean energy technologies for the United States specifically, and they look at several key technologies: solar voltaics, batteries, wind turbine systems, green steel, and carbon capture and sequestration. And they assess the economic risks of interdependence to be reasonably high for solar voltaics and batteries, medium for the other categories. But most of the national security risks they see as quite low, maybe medium for dual use technologies for batteries, and medium for critical infrastructure risks for wind turbines, and the rest of the risks for most of the other technologies are low. So that raises the question of what do they mean by national security risks? And in their mind, there are only two that are relevant. One is the risks of systemic outages to critical infrastructure, mostly related to cyber risks of sabotage. And the second are dual-use technologies that have both civilian and military uses. So again, for batteries, they think those national security risks are medium. For dual-use technologies and for wind turbines, they think the systemic risks of outages as a result of, say, cyber hacking are medium for critical infrastructure. In two pieces from me and co-authors, we assess Davidson's argument that there are limited national security risks for the U.S. of dependence on China for clean technologies. We try to see if there are other national security risks that aren't accounted for by that Davidson paper, and get into as much granular detail as we can about the specific supply chain links between the U.S. and China. And what we find is that China's dominance of critical minerals and clean technologies is not because of geologic endowments of these materials, except in a few cases like graphite and rare earths. Rather, China's dominance of clean technology supply chains comes from its global dominance of processing of critical minerals and component manufacturing. And the U.S. is less reliant on China specifically for particular critical minerals, although it's true for graphite and rare earths and a few other materials. But the U.S. has diversified many of its specific inputs for those minerals to other partners. China's influence may come about, though, through pricing mechanisms and its ability to influence global prices and drive other competitors out of the market. The U.S. also has significant lithium-ion battery manufacturing for those finished batteries, but it has limited capability to manufacture components like cathodes and anodes and other pieces of the battery supply chain, and that's also true for other aspects of clean technologies as well. So in the paper in War on the Rocks that I wrote along with co-authors, we identified 4 different potential national security risks of dependence on China for clean technologies. One has to do with economic coercion, the other has to do with dual-use technologies, the third has to do with cyber risks, and the fourth has to do with what we call the commanding heights. Now, in terms of economic coercion, it's like the episode we saw last summer with rare earths and the risk of supply chain disruptions due to geopolitical disputes between the U.S. and China, and the ability for China to withhold those critical inputs to the U.S. economy could be used as a source of coercive leverage and have very devastating effects on the U.S. economy if they were allowed to persist. This is something that we see in other spaces, such as Russia's ability to use its coercive leverage over gas and oil over Europe, for example. The reason why the U.S. considered the potential for economic coercion to rise to the level of national security risk, in that key sectors of the economy could be brought to a standstill without access to a continual resupply of rare earth materials, which were necessary for the auto sector and other key economic sectors. Now, in this case, there's an overlapping national security concern because those same rare earths also have uses in military equipment. So this is separate but overlapping concern about dual-use technologies. Those rare earths are also used for magnets for guidance systems in missiles and other uses. but it's a separate concern from economic coercion. A third concern is of internet-connected clean technologies that could be used for cyber attacks or surveillance or other forms of sabotage. And for that reason, the US, for example, has banned Chinese internet-connected technologies associated with electric vehicles. Now, these risks may be overstated and manageable, but it's another national security concern that has been identified. The fourth national security risk that we identify in the War on the Rocks piece that we really expand on is the so-called commanding heights of the US economy. And this harkens back to the notion during the Cold War that there are key economic sectors that a state has an interest in supporting because they are a major source of economic growth and technological sophistication. And if we think that batteries are becoming like semiconductors that have multiple applications in different sectors of the US economy and are going to be major growth sectors for the US economy, then batteries and wider clean technologies are considered commanding heights, key strategic sectors that the US has an interest in maintaining US domestic capacity. And the risk of loss of manufacturing capacity and strength in those areas is that the US would be comparatively poorer for it than it otherwise would be, and that because economic growth is fungible into military capacity, a slower growing US economy that didn't have a vibrant, active clean tech sector would lack as much material wealth to be able to fund its military. And indeed, those clean technologies have overlapping applications and abilities to be used in the military sector to support the military sector, and in times of war, perhaps pivoting from heavy industry for civilian uses to be used for military applications. So these are the reasons why key commanding heights of the US economy include batteries and wider clean technologies that the US has an interest from a national security perspective in supporting. The notion of commanding heights is back in vogue after falling out of favor at the end of the Cold War, when neoliberal capitalism was the dominant model where firms determined where to site and source their manufacturing facilities and where to get raw materials. The reason why that notion of the commanding heights is back in vogue is that China's state-led form of capitalism has allowed it to come to dominate key economic sectors in the global economy, and that puts at risk other countries in their ability to maintain manufacturing sectors, and has led to perceptions of over-reliance on China for key inputs, including, as we saw during the COVID epidemic, for personal protective equipment and pharmaceuticals. But there are wider concerns about China's dominance of manufacturing, in particular in the clean technology space. So that has created renewed interest in industrial policy of active state-led efforts to support key sectors of the economy to maintain viable manufacturing sectors of their own, that they're less dependent upon China for those key inputs. So industrial policy includes subsidies, tax incentives, regulations, infrastructure investments, credit to favor certain economic sectors, government procurement. It can even include export and investment controls to limit involvement of international actors in key sectors, and it assumes a more active role of the government in the economy. It may even include the government taking an ownership stake in certain companies. And again, the reasons why a country from a national security perspective may want to have an active industrial policy is to prevent the country from being caught off guard to supply chain disruptions for key inputs. It could also ensure that the country retains manufacturing capacity in strategically important sectors. It may also ensure that the country continues to retain an advantage in sectors that it already possesses some
capability in and comparatively better than other countries, like the way the US has imposed export controls on semiconductor chips. And the final reason is that a country may engage in forms of industrial policy to insulate the country from dangerous imports or dangerous investment. And here we can think about the way the US has banned investments from Huawei, or the US has banned Chinese internet-connected electric vehicles. There are also real risks of industrial policy, that the government ends up making bad bets and picks the wrong sectors or wrong companies as winners. It can bias the economy and may distort it in support of some companies at the expense of others, undermining overall economic performance. You may also be concerned that people or companies who get the contracts are close to the governing parties in power, so it can facilitate corruption. It may also lead to unsustainable dependence on the government by those key economic sectors who don't become competitive internationally. So if there are disruptions in government support, we may find that those sectors are uncompetitive internationally and not able to survive on their own. The last piece that we talked about this week was from Theo Riofrancos on the security sustainability nexus. And she noted during the Biden era that there was an overlap of arguments in support of this de-risking and onshoring of clean tech manufacturing that was driven by the government's concern about national security, about wanting to have less dependence on China and to have some national production, or at least some production sourced from allied countries. And then there's an overlapping private sector interest in sustainability that comes from the sort of moment in which there was more concern about climate change. And so private sector actors were interested in making profits from the onshoring of manufacturing and mining in the US and Europe, and in the service of this wider sustainability agenda. And this reinforcing security sustainability nexus created an impetus for de-risking and movement away of mining and manufacturing from China to the US and Europe. But there were some ambiguities and contradictions embedded in this, in that the private sector motives were really in support of profit, and there was a real concern about whether or not consumers at the end of the day would be willing to pay, say, sort of the extra cost of so-called sustainable materials that are produced in the global north, where there's often going to be a cost premium because of higher environmental regulations, higher labor costs, and higher other costs due to unfamiliarity of making these goods. As we've seen, when the sustainability concerns diminished with the election of Donald Trump to the presidency, private sector interest in sustainability diminished. And so you still have an impetus for onshoring of mining, but we've taken away at least some of the incentives for private sector actors to participate in that space by removing the sort of sustainability-driven concerns for electric vehicles. So it remains to be seen whether or not the interest from the Trump administration in onsourcing of mining and processing will be a sufficient driver of private sector interest, given the limited demand for minerals and processed materials just for military uses. We're seeing perhaps the rise of other demand signals from for batteries for support of energy storage for artificial intelligence, but we have removed a key driver with the loss of support and for electric vehicles in the meantime. One of the challenges for expanding mining, either in the global north or anywhere around the world, is the historic reputation for being a relatively polluting industry. And there's a reason why mining moved out of countries in the global north to other polities, in part because it was easier to for those mining companies to conduct their operations in places where there were lower environmental and labor standards. And that raises the concern, if there's an expansion of mining to provide for batteries or other needs, that there'll be global sacrifice zones of places that are merely sources of raw materials that are sought to serve the greater good, but the interests of those local communities have to be sacrificed in the process. Now, hopefully mining has improved considerably since then, but there may be some inevitable trade-offs at the local level where there are going to be deleterious localized impacts on the natural environment in the places where those minerals come from, and those have to be managed, and it's not clear that they will be managed successfully to protect local actors' interests wherever that occurs. Now, it should be noted that the access to fossil fuels has a much larger geographic footprint than localized mines are supposed to have. Nonetheless, we have to be concerned about whether mining for the clean energy transition will lead to local conflicts over how those resources are being accessed, what are the local impacts of those mining operations, and how are those gains from those resources distributed. Those could be sites of contestation, sometimes violent, if not handled well.
One last question we posed this week is what to do about reducing the risks of the clean energy transition and geopolitical tension. More diplomacy between the US and China is one potential answer to reduce the risks of an economic arms race between the countries that could then escalate and intersect with other national security challenges. There could be more careful de-risking and diversification, but an avoidance of rapid decoupling, which would have more negative deleterious impacts on the global economy and global relations. There, on the part of the US, there may need to be more consistent policy that the flux of and volatility of US policy in recent years in industrial policy may set back its efforts to improve its own national security position. And there's a wider need for awareness of the disruptive potential of the transition itself. And for local impacts of, say, mining, there also needs to be greater attention to the needs of local communities to ensure that these efforts to source raw materials for the clean energy transition don't lead to negative security outcomes like local conflicts over valuable natural resources.